Good afternoon, everybody. So people are just moving in. My name is Volker Stollertz. I'm the chief editor of the Science Media Center. And I have the pleasure to introduce our next CyCar 2020 keynote speaker, which is David Caswell. He is an executive product manager at BBC News Labs. And if you want to know more about his bio, go to Shed. It's a very interesting journey he did. And David Caswell actually asked a very tough question, and that is, what kind of innovation will the news industry need in the coming decade? So what do we have to do to stay in business, basically? He distinguishes ordinary innovation in the news industry from what he calls existential innovation, which is what newsrooms have to do because structural changes in the information ecosystem made it necessary for journalism to change because of increasing scarcity of our attention. The human attention span is basically limited, and if lots of digital communications compete, so how can media stay in business? And David will explain what questions newsrooms have to ask in this historically new environment, and in what ways they should look for existential innovations, maybe, to survive in the digital age. So, David, it's a pleasure to have you here. We are all very interested to hear your perspective and your vision for a future of quality journalism in the future.
Great. Well, thank you for inviting me. I am going to share my slides now. Let's see if I can find them. They're there. Okay.
Looks good.
Great. And yes, before I start, I'll just give a brief introduction. I've been working at the BBC for about 2 years, and prior to that, I spent some time in academic work focused on this idea of structured journalism or modular forms of journalism. And prior to that, I spent about a decade at Yahoo. So I've basically kind of come out of the Silicon Valley kind of technical world, and then spent some time in academia on this, and then I've been at the BBC putting some of these ideas into practice for the last 2 years. So let me start off by let me see if I can get this right here. There we go. Let me start off just by kind of acknowledging that there's been a lot of bad news about journalism in the last decade, 2 decades or so. Misinformation, fake news, decaying trust, newspapers closing, and even digitally native news organizations closing. There's just this sort of endless list of bad things that are going on in the news world. And this sort of little collection here of articles, this is all just from the last week or two. You know, it's just this endless onslaught. And we have this kind of new vocabulary of all of these things, these problems, these negative things that are happening in the news world. And it's sometimes rather difficult to kind of make sense of what's going on. They're all, they're all obviously serious. They're interconnected. A lot of these terms and ideas are new. People are still adapting to what they are, and sometimes bad actors are adapting faster than journalists, and so it's quite a confusing environment, but with this sort of big negative backdrop. And the data kind of proves this out. I won't get into the specifics here, but by any metric that you can imagine, news is not doing well. The number of journalists employed in newsrooms, the trust in news, the amount of time that young people are spending with news, and on and on and on. The data holds up this view that something big and negative is happening in the news world. Although again, it's complicated and it's very difficult to sort of find that common thread. So if we kind of stand back from all this bad news and try to think, well, is there a simpler kind of root or fundamental reason for all of this? Can we wade through this and put some order on it to try to understand maybe the first principles of what are going on? And I think it's worth doing that systematically, it's very easy to say something like, well, it's the internet, but that's really not an explanation. That's just a noun. So perhaps we can kind of dig in a little bit and see if there's a root explanation for this. And I think a lens to do that through is this idea of the topology or the shape of human communication. And it might be worth here just going through a short history of the shape of human communication. So it starts off, let's say about 70,000 years ago, 72,000 years ago. And this is what paleoanthropologists call the cognitive revolution, where we first start seeing humans do symbolic acts and leave symbolic artifacts, things like necklaces and face painting and all this kind of stuff. And that was roughly, I guess, when language started. It's very hard to know. Nobody knows for sure. There's debate. But let's just say language starts back in prehistory in those days. And that communication that it enables, that natural language enables, is essentially person to person. So I have to say the words and you have to hear the words in order for communication to occur. And even when we invented writing, so this is maybe 5,000 years ago, 6,000 years ago, when I chiseled something on a tablet or write something on a piece of paper, you actually have to read the actual ink that I wrote. And so that communication too is personal. It's one person communicating to another person through a medium, but personally nonetheless. And that was the form or the shape of human communication for almost all of history and prehistory. Then something changed in the 1400s, and this was obviously the invention of movable type and the printing press, Gutenberg. And for the first time, we had this new shape of communication in that a person could create this artifact, say a book or a pamphlet or a page, whatever it was, and they could use this machine, the printing press, to make many, many, many copies and then distribute those copies. And that was new because that let one person simultaneously speak to many, many, many other people. So where the personal communication was one-to-one, this new form of communication was one-to-many. One person could communicate simultaneously with many people. And then we extended that in the 1920s and the 1930s into real-time communication. So radio communication and then television communication. But underlying those, very important and impactful inventions was the same idea of one-to-many communication. One broadcaster is sitting in a studio communicating with many people. And now, of course, we're in this new environment of network communication, or what we might call many-to-many communication. And this came along primarily with the internet, call it the World Wide Web in 1993. There were other parts to it, but it's mostly the internet. And this many-to-many communication is radically different. It's a different shape of communication than the one-to-many communication that we've had since the printing press was invented. And this is something that we're still all adapting to. Anybody can communicate anything to any other person anywhere in the world at any time. That's a new phenomena in human history. And it has some pretty big implications. So whereas in the one-to-many communication environment, it was the publisher or the broadcaster that had this sort of special access or special control over the communication. You had to own a printing press and the distribution for printing, or you had to own access to airwaves and broadcast towers to communicate with many people. Now anybody can do that. And so what has happened is that the communication power has moved from the individual communicators, the publishers and the broadcasters, over to platforms or these intermediaries that enable this communication. And I know that all this is fairly obvious, but it's just kind of worth going through this change in the shape of human communication systematically. So it has some characteristics, this new many-to-many communication shape. So one of them is that, and I won't go through all of these, but one of them is that unlike the printing press and then radio and television broadcasting, which were invented at kind of different times in history, the ability to communicate in real time in a many-to-many environment occurred at the same time as the ability to communicate, in permanent writing across space and time, and that was the internet. It was you could post a blog and it would last forever, or you could do a live stream to anybody in the world, and that facility basically came along at the same time. That's a new thing. The artifacts that are used in the many-to-many communication environment are also worth taking a look at. At the moment, these are the same artifacts that we used in the one-to-many communication environment. So in other words, text articles or text documents, which would have been recognizable as early as the 1600s, are still kind of the main thing that we're using on the internet for news communication. And then another thing that's worth considering here is the rate at which the artifacts that these kinds of communication, the rate at which they accumulate. So back in the personal communication days or the one-to-one communication days, there were very few artifacts. But in the broadcast era, in the printing and the audio or the radio and television era, there were more artifacts, but those increased in a fairly linear way. But when we get to this new communication environment in which everyone can communicate, the accumulation of those artifacts is exponential. And this has some implications. So one implication is that this shape of communication, or this topology of communication, it's the end state topology. There's nowhere to go from here. There is no fourth shape of human communication. If you come back in 50,000 years in a time machine, you'll see that we're still communicating in a many-to-many communication environment. So that's a little interesting. To state the obvious, there are no naturally privileged communicators. Obviously, in the broadcast era, you had a natural privilege would accrue to the person who owns the printing press or the person who owns the broadcast station. There are no naturally privileged communicators in the many-to-many communication environment. There's a trust implication here in that the number of trust decisions that the receiver has to make is proportional to the number of communicators. And that wasn't a problem in the one-to-many communication environment because there was a very small number of communicators. But in a world where there are literally billions of communicators at some level, the number of trust decisions is dramatically higher. And then there's this phenomena where just the quantity of messages that are available increases exponentially with the number of communicators. In the one-to-many broadcast era, that was also true, but there were so few communicators, it was essentially linear, but that's no longer the case. And so these are sort of some fundamental characteristics of this new many-to-many communication environment that we're all in. And there are some consequences for news. There are three big consequences for news. So one of them is that any individual news producer is less relevant in this environment. And we'll go through that in a little more detail in a few slides. But where the news producer used to have this special role, that is no longer the case. And it's less the case over time. Again, the number of trust decisions that each news consumer has to make increases quite dramatically. And it passes this number. There's a number called Dunbar's number, which is the number of relationships that a human being can hold in their head at any one time. And there's argument about whether it's 120 or 240, or there's various ideas about what that number is. But that number has been dramatically exceeded by the number of trust decisions that news consumers have to make. There's just too many news producers. And then also there's this sense-making burden that news producers or news consumers have to take on. So they have to take all of these little pieces of communication and for the first time, they have to connect them themselves and make sense of them themselves. Are they trustworthy? What is the context? What are the connections with other news communications? And that is a new challenge. And I think all of those complicated things that are going on in the news environment right now, that whole set of terms kind of comes down essentially to these three consequences for news from this new many-to-many communication environment. So how can we look at this? Like, what is a lens or a way of looking at this new environment? that will help us to kind of make sense of it and maybe perhaps navigate it. Well, one way of looking at it is through the lens of economics, and not monetary economics, but more the economics of attention, the supply of attention and the demands for attention, for human attention. And this is a relatively new field of literature. Really, we only start seeing attention being given to this and sort of substantial publication happening as recently as like 5 years ago, 7 years ago. It's a pretty new field, but it's a pretty useful lens for looking at this new communication environment. And if you wade through the literature that we have so far on this, it's actually quite simple. You end up with this relationship between the supply of information seeking attention and the demand of attention for that information. And so the scarce attention, the attention that we have to give to information, is essentially linear. It's actually even flat or a constant, because there's nowhere else in our lives that we can consume media anymore. Our lives are full of media consumption opportunities. So that ability to consume information is flat, but the availability of information is increasing exponentially. So we have this situation where the difference between the attention that we have to give and the amount of information seeking that attention, that difference itself is exponential, because the difference between an exponential phenomena and a constant or a linear phenomena is itself exponential. And so that sets up this competition that is essentially zero sum, because you can only give attention to something new by taking it away from something else. And it's also unwinnable because you're fighting an exponential phenomena. And so that graph there, in a simplistic way, kind of sums up the core challenge, the core mathematical challenge that news producers or news publishers or broadcasters are facing. And so if you look at it from the point of view of any individual news publisher, essentially their portion of the communication in the ecosystem shrinks and shrinks and shrinks. And this is a metric that's known as share of voice. It used to be an important metric in the advertising world, and it's basically the measure of all communication, the portion of all communication in the environment that is coming from the individual advertiser, or in this case, the individual news producer. And that share of voice for any individual news producer just mathematically shrinks and shrinks and shrinks over time as that exponential curve increases. And that shrinkage, or that loss of share of voice, is inexorable. In other words, there's nothing that really can be done about it. It's a mathematical phenomena at some level. And of course, there are little variations to this. Some publishers have a brand and credibility, and some publishers have new products and ways of communicating that are fashionable for a while. So there are little variations to this, but generally, in aggregate, over time, this loss of share of voice is inevitable. So we see this in lots of places. Obviously, here's a graph from the U.S., and this shows that in around the middle of 2018, the amount of time spent per adult on mobile exceeded that spent on television. This point of cross here happened earlier in other markets, but in the U.S., mobile has now taken more attention than television. So television was a one-to-many communication environment. Mobile internet is a many-to-many communication environment. We see that in the global numbers for those platforms, the mediators in that many-to-many communication environment. This is an incredible graph here. This is the percent of internet users who are using these platforms more than once per day. And there's a lot of platforms on this list, and those percentages are quite high. So this is the sort of the tangible expression of that many-to-many communication environment. And then, of course, for news, this has repercussions on where people get their news. This is a graph for the UK. It's similar for other countries. The Reuters Institute 2020 report has graphs for, I think, about 20 or 30 countries. And they're all broadly similar at different stages of the cycle. Print and television is declining. In other words, the one-to-many communication tools are declining, and more people are getting their news or more news from social media and from the internet. And this is what it looks like in practice. Some of these numbers are just staggering. Donald Trump, for example, has about 90 million subscribers or followers on his Twitter account. Kim Kardashian has well over 100 million followers on her Instagram account. There are outlets like the far-right outlet Breitbart, whose Facebook page attracts more audience than the BBC News at 6 or News at 10. These are huge, huge numbers, and sort of this is something that we're all familiar with from our day-to-day browsing experience on the internet, but it adds up, and this is the competition that we're talking about. So that kind of sets up this kind of fundamental question here that we have to answer, which is, well, given that the challenge here is at some level mathematical, how can we rebuild a news environment that informs people, that keeps people feeling that they understand their world, that's trustworthy, that we all have faith in, and that is a reasonable representation of the truth, and sustainable. In other words, the business or the revenue that pays for it and keeps it going makes sense too. How can we set up a news ecosystem that does all that in this new many-to-many communication environment? That's sort of the heart of the challenge, the existential challenge, as I called it in that article, that we're all facing here. So let's have a look at that. So one way to look at it is through this idea of a paradigm. And a paradigm, the term was popularized in this famous book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And a good example of a paradigm is this Copernican paradigm, where before Copernicus you had this very complicated explanation for how the planets and the stars were moving, and the sun and the moon, and that complicated explanation was complicated because it placed the Earth at the center of the system, and people made progress in that system. They could explain things with more complicated mathematics and all that. But if you change the paradigm, if you put the sun at the center of the system instead of the Earth, then all of the mathematics became much, much easier. It became much simpler, much clearer, because that's what represented the truth. And that change from Earth-centered to sun-centered solar system, that was the Copernican paradigm. And that idea of a paradigm where you change how you perceive something fundamentally, that is the kind of thing that unlocks these very mathematical, very fundamental problems, such as the one we're facing, trying to rebuild news for the networked or many-to-many communication environment. So there's been a bunch of paradigms for news in the digital world. It used to be directories. We're going to have people. We're going to organize all this stuff and put it into directories and categories. Then it was going to be search. We were just going to Google everything. And then for a period in the early, about 2010 to 2013, 2014, it was going to be these endless scroll personalized news feeds. And more recently, there's a new paradigm for search that's based on the semantic units rather than the keywords. It's more a business tool at the moment. And these are all kind of different ways of maybe trying to find a new paradigm for news, but they haven't been very successful, and they haven't kind of left us in a materially better place. What I'm going to talk about for the rest of the talk here is a different paradigm. It's you could call it the structured journalism paradigm. It's the phrase that I'm used to calling it, structured journalism. A broader term for it is the modular content paradigm. It's a little broader beyond just news. There's several other terms for it too. Atomized news is something that you hear from time to time. I'm going to use the term modular content for the rest of the talk because that's just a good broad term, but there are multiple names for this. So let's look a little bit at that modular content paradigm. The basic assumption that it's centered on here is that the problem is the artifacts. It's the actual physical things, but the things that the news production process creates. And at the moment, our artifacts of news are essentially artifacts that we've brought over from the pre-digital world, or the one-to-many communication environment. And these are things like text articles, radio programs, television programs, these kind of things. But the problem is that those artifacts are not well matched with the many-to-many communication environment in the digital world, because they become commodities when anybody can produce them. So anybody can produce text and audio and video, and so these things in and of themselves become worth less and less and less, just as units of information, than they did in the previous one-to-many environment, when it was a very rare thing to own a printing press or a broadcast station. And so if it is the artifacts, if we accept that assumption, and if it is the artifacts, then the challenge that we have here is to find new artifacts. And these artifacts should help us to create and hold on to new kinds of value that work in the digital world, that work in this many-to-many communication environment. And the hope here, or the expectation, is that if we change the units or the artifacts, we can change the game, we can change the mathematics that are going on in this many-to-many communication environment. And so I've only got 2 Lego slides here, but the obvious metaphor for this is Lego. And essentially what we're talking about here is deconstructing the content of news itself into smaller units that are editorially or even semantically coherent. And then once we have all those units, then we use those to rebuild or reconstruct news artifacts, or news experiences, I guess would be a better word, and to do that in different ways for different people in different situations. So we deconstruct this one-size-fits-all kind of news into its little components, and then we use those little components to rebuild things that are personalized and are experienced differently by different people. That's the basic concept. And to carry this Lego metaphor just a little bit further, there are only 2 parts to this. If you look at each individual atom or unit of news, you've got the piece of content itself, and that can be data, it can be text, it can be audio, it can be video, but you've got this small coherent piece of content, and then you've got metadata, and the metadata is what allows you to connect one piece of content to another in a sensible way, and kind of use it in an intelligent experience. And these are the 2 components of each module in this modular content paradigm. And taking that a little bit further, you can look at this as a continuum between just natural language, say text or speech at one end, and data itself on the other end with no natural language at all. And then there's this continuum where you go from having mostly language with maybe a little bit of data, all the way through to having just data with no language. And these modules can exist all the way along this continuum. I'll show some examples here in a minute. From the audience's perspective, this lets you do something like this. It lets you take these old pre-digital one-to-many artifacts, say a newspaper page with articles, and where we've gone into the internet world, or the digital world, or the many-to-many communication world, and all this is multiplied and confused by breaking these apart into modules and connecting those modules together. We might be able to organize and systematically manage these into newly valuable experiences for audiences, so they experience something that is much more coherent than the internet as it exists today. From the production point of view, this is from the journalist production point of view, whereas the traditional process of journalism is basically about understanding the stuff that you're doing some reporting, and then understanding that reporting, and then writing articles by hand. This new paradigm basically enables or expects that reporting and sense making is structured in some way, and that the story itself is available as structure, and then that structure is used to produce lots and lots of different experiences, summaries or articles or other news products, whatever it happens to be. This isn't new. In fact, the general concept in different guises has been around since Aristotle. It was quite it was quite a serious topic of conversation during the Enlightenment era as well. Descartes talked about it and others. But the most recent description of this is in terms of the semantic web, Tim Berners-Lee. And this is about 20 years old at this point, and the semantic web as a paradigm has not really taken off that well. But it's this same concept that keeps coming back in different forms again and again and again. In News Labs, we do a lot of work with this. In fact, about half of what we do is basically kind of modular content in some form. This is a project that we call SOLCO, Semi-Automated Local Content, that basically tells data stories by organizing them into these story models, which become the artifact, which we can then use through a technology called natural language generation to produce many, many personalized articles. So instead of having the article itself or the handwritten article as a story, we have the story model itself as a story, a new artifact, a new modular artifact. And then that is used with technology to produce the articles. And we used that recently to produce stories, result stories for the general election in the UK in 2019. We've also moved that, although in an experimental way, beyond just text into synthetic speech and then into synthetic video, where we have talking head video that is basically telling stories fully automatically that originated in data. And this is an area that we're exploring at the moment. We have a project that we did over the summer that deconstructs articles and produces essentially comics from those articles. There's a little bit of an editorial control portion in the middle, but essentially it turns articles into deconstructed bullet points and then turns those bullet points into comics. And we've just started publishing stories in our help desk on social media from that tool. And at the moment, we're expanding that tool into other kinds of components, including different lengths of text, image galleries, spoken text, and so on. We've done projects that involve explainers or question answering in various guises, where we can expand keywords into further explanations or questions into answers. We've done work on having different versions of stories, long versions, short versions, video versions. A lot of these are semi-automatic. We've done a lot of work by breaking our stories down into components that are used as dialogue trees for chat or voice interaction. These are published. This is the BBC's voice products feature these lives. These are developed in News Labs. We do a lot of work with bots and have done a lot of work with bots, including tools that let journalists use bots, build their own bots quite easily. And these all rely on those little pieces of content on the left there that are broken up and connected together. We've done projects that take individual stories and break up the interior of the story in ways where the story can be told simultaneously in voice or in audio, in text, and in video. So those story connection points between parts of the story connect all the way through those, so that the user can switch back and forth between video and audio and text. So you could do something like listen to a story as a podcast on your headphones, then decide you want to read it, say on the subway on the way to work. So you would you would switch to text and pick it up there, and then maybe when you get home, you would put it on your television and consume it as video. We've done a lot of work in deconstructing things like television and radio programs and podcasts into small editorially or semantically coherent pieces that we can then use for personalization and so on. We've done this with quite a few different kinds of output that we work with. And each of these tools or each of these products that we've worked with, it is one of three kind of formats. Like one format is this idea where, instead of producing the article, we produce the story model as the artifact, as the modular artifact, or essentially these are collections of modular artifacts. And then we use those to produce variants or content variants. And then each content variant gets served to a different audience segment. We do another form of these where we break apart the units, the containers of these semantic and editorially coherent units, and then we reassemble them in different ways for different audience members. So we might add more context or put less context in, or we might make things more descriptive or less descriptive. And then we have the dialogue trees, where we take little pieces of content and then arrange them in a way that a voice or a chat interaction can access them intelligently. And these are the general forms of the structured journalism projects or the modular content projects that we do. There's a lot of other teams at the BBC that are doing similar projects. A big one is the new content management system, which is a post-article modular content management system. There's projects like object-based media, which is essentially around these branching narrative kind of experiences. That's been running for about 4 years. A lot of voice and AI products are based on these atomized or small units of text. So there's a lot of different teams, including mostly production teams, that are working with news as a small unit beneath the article size or beneath the program size, all the way through the BBC. And then it's not just the BBC that's working on this. Lots of different news organizations in lots of different ways are working on similar concepts. I understand that at the conference this morning, Bavarian Radio talked about some similar work. There's a lot of innovation work going on. For example, at the Wall Street Journal, almost all of it focused on modular or structured content. The Washington Post, they have a CMS, the content management system, that, like the BBC's content management system, is post-article or modular. Its basic data structure is blocks. There's a news publisher, a digital news publisher in the United States called Axios, which is an entirely editorial form of structured content, where they basically haven't gone a technical route at all. They basically just format the structure, essentially in a word processor and put it on their page. The Press Association is doing a lot of interesting work around automated journalism based on templates and story models and so on. So this is something that lots of other news organizations are also pursuing. It's small. It's this is not a major part of any news organization's portfolio, but it's pretty persistent. And then beyond news, you can kind of see the same thing happening in essentially every other information-centric domain. So for example, in scientific publishing, they're facing basically the same problem that the news world is facing for essentially the same reasons. There's just too many papers to process, and the value of each one goes down. It's very hard to keep up a context of what's happening in a field or literature. And so scientific publishing, one of the proposed solutions for that crisis in scientific publishing is this idea of nano publication. And this is more focused at the moment on things like biosemantics and pharmaceuticals, where basically publishing happens at this very, very small level with careful annotation with metadata that can be used to create these very, very easy to understand reports of what is happening in a certain field or pertaining to a certain, for example, molecule or form of test or whatever. Law is seeing the same problem. It's very, very difficult for legal firms to keep up with the tsunami of information, and they're turning to computable forms of law based on these structured units to address that problem. The intelligence world, the government intelligence world, is facing similar problems. Organizations like DARPA in the United States or IARPA in the United States, these are research organizations that are building very significant systems that essentially do what structured journalism does. This example here, the ADA program, it basically breaks down media, video and audio and text and speech into little pieces, and then reconstructs those into storylines or hypotheses that can be understood by an analyst. And then enterprise knowledge management. Big companies are drowning in information, and it's very hard to understand what's going on, even with projects. And so companies like OpenText and Cambridge Semantics are putting together essentially structured or modular kind of views of content. So this core concept of modularity or structure and content, it's showing up all over the place, basically originating independently in many different places. So let's just finish up here by looking at what might happen in the long term from this form of content. And it's almost a cliche to say, well, in the long term, we tend to underestimate how profound things change. There's a lot of hype in the short term, and we tend to overestimate what will happen in the next year or two. But when we look out a little further, we tend to underestimate. That's certainly true of the internet, and it may be true here too. So what might modular content or structured journalism enable in the long term? Well, one thing it will do, and it's doing this already, it certainly is for us, is to enable news to be more personalized. So that's personalized to the individual or the locality or the situation or the context. And what that would enable is for the way that a story is told to be suited to the person rather than to the news producer. Right now, the news producer, the journalist, decides how the story will be told. Maybe in the future that will be personalized and will be controllable or will be adapted to the individual. It enables news to be more like data, to be more systematic and to be more cumulative. So we have this phenomena at the moment, because we're dealing with text and video, that it's very hard to understand what happened a week ago. We know what's happening in the news today, but what happened in the news last week and what happened in the news last month, that's a much vaguer, harder thing to pin down. Whereas news in structured format, we can accumulate that, and we can hold that as context and express that in news products in a way that might blur this distinction between news and archives. And that's a pretty powerful thing, because what that might let us do is refine news over time to collect and increase and refine and count and understand, so that we have this large, permanent, growing knowledge body that we build from our news. And that in itself would change the equation on trust. It might make news less artisanal or less handmade and more collective or industrial. In other words, it might take the individual journalist, not out of the equation, but give them a different role rather than to create the finished product from start to finish. And the way that it does that is because it separates the collecting of journalistic knowledge, the reporting, from the actual production of the artifact. So it lets people collaborate on creating news. It lets people decide how to present news without having to talk to or interact with the person who produced the news in the first place. And these would enable very, very different modes of production or workflows for production in news. And then finally, it gives journalists a way to control news or to add those journalistic values to news in a world in which machine learning and artificial intelligence control more and more of the media environment. This could potentially be quite an important one, depending on how things develop. So just the last slide here, we've all been through this first wave of digital disruption in news. Those stories that I started with kind of show that that complex set of problems that we're facing in news, and that disruption was primarily in the distribution of news. The artifacts, the units were the same, still articles just like the old days, still bits of video, bits of audio, just like the old days. But what has changed is the way those are distributed. Instead of being distributed in newspapers and on radio stations and television stations, they're distributed on social and search and podcasts and so on. And this is, to be honest, has produced mostly problems for us. A lot of benefits too, but a lot of very, very big problems. It's certainly perceived more as a set of problems than a set of benefits. But perhaps we have a second wave of digital disruption coming, centered around the units of news or the artifacts. And this might be a wave of disruption that creates entirely new artifacts of news that we haven't seen before. News that you can interact with almost like a human agent. News that is essentially personalized to an incredible degree to the individual. And if we can kind of get through this and navigate this second wave, this may focus more on solutions, or may generate more ways to find solutions than the first wave did. And that's why I'm at the BBC, is to try to participate in ways to make that happen. So that is the end of my presentation. I will end it there and see if there's any questions.
Yeah, great. Thanks, David. It was a great talk. Now, if you have questions, please write them down here. I see the first coming. I have one question. Can you comment a little bit on how does the journalist's role in the production of these modularized news change, basically? First, you have to do all the investigations, reporting, stuff, bringing together. So what's happening then, exactly? So what is the journalist basically then doing in creating these modules, and how is it interacting with data and artificial intelligence or whatever? Yep. So can you describe it a little bit in practice? How is it done?
Yeah, it's challenging. So when people first sort of look at these kind of concepts, they often assume that the challenges are technical, because it sounds technical, like it sounds like an analytical, computational way of looking at news. But the technical challenges are actually not as large as the editorial challenges. Yeah. And what we essentially have to do in this world is we have to learn how to produce editorial units that are very different than the editorial units we're used to. An example would be for the voice product that News Labs developed, and which is now live with the BBC's voice agents. This has these little pieces that you have to author. You have to write these, and they're sometimes as small as a sentence, and maybe between a paragraph and a sentence. You have to write these in a way that they're useful in that context. And that took quite a bit of time to learn how to do that. I think we're still at the very early stages of learning how to editorially author modular content. There are some learnings that we've got in specific areas. Conversational is one. Natural language generation and automated content is another. I think it's pretty well understood at this point, but we've just begun that road.
Yeah, here's a question from Kira Schacht, and she wanted to know a little bit in the same direction. How did you implement these modular articles in the BBC newsrooms, and not on a technical level, but more in terms of infrastructure and acceptance in the newsroom? So can you say something about that?
Well, the infrastructure is hard because just of the way infrastructure works in big media organizations. I'm sure anyone in a newsroom will appreciate that. On the acceptance side, I have been surprised at how accepting people in the newsroom have been. When I first came to the BBC, I expected that there would be a lot of resistance to these forms of news, especially things like the more automated forms of news. But we haven't seen any of that at all. In fact, the story model work that we did for the election, which essentially automated journalism, we first started experimenting with that in, I think it was about April of 2019, and we were able to publish in full production the results of the election in December 2019. And that's very fast. I mean, I don't see how any organization could have gone from concept to production as fast as that. And that a lot of that is because the editorial people understood it and accepted it and saw it as a useful public service tool. So I am starting to suspect that there's less resistance in newsrooms to these kind of techniques than people assume.
Yeah, lots of questions, of course. Here's one from Andreas Loos, and he thanks you for this interesting talk. And here's a question: a journalist's work consists in large part in weighing and bringing facts into the context to each other. And if you fragment or modularize the content, users may lose the big picture. So how do you keep the picture if you have all these little modules and freely recombining them into new artifacts?
I think it depends on the kind of news story. I think that there's always going to be news stories that are so novel or so intricate or so unusual that you just have to write text, and that could be a substantial portion of news stories, even for some time into the future. But there's also a very large body of journalism that is essentially formulaic, and this isn't just stories that come from data, which is an increasing portion of the news news output, are stories that come from data, but it's stories that are that are essentially variations on a theme. Things like business stories. Every acquisition of a company is similar at some level. Every science story that originates with the publishing of a paper or a study is similar at some level. And I think these formulaic stories are where this form of journalism has the most utility. I think there will probably always be some stories that you can't easily modularize, but that might only be 20-30% of journalism.
Yeah. Here's a question from Franco Zotta. He asked a little bit the question of authorship. So in the modular news model, does the consumer or the news consumer knows who produced the news and in what way? And if they largely follow modularized and different artifacts played out stories, how do they basically then develop trust? So because in the many-to-many communications biotope, he asks, it becomes more and more important that you have a few trustable news producers. And that's basically the definition of quality journalism. But the question is, how do people get access to that quality in this situation?
The data on trust shows that, and this is generally, that people are trusting journalists less and less and less. But the trust in newsrooms and in journalism organizations, that has remained fairly stable. And what may be happening there is that people are less willing to accept a point of view, basically, and they still remain trustful of systems and processes that ensure validation of news. And so I think the structured forms of journalism, they help and they work in that regard. I mean, evidence is structure. The number of people that you talk to as a journalist is structure. The provenance of the story or the artifacts is structure. The source documents are structure. You can't publish all of this, but this very basic idea of linking to source documents where you can in a story, something as simple as that is a form of structure. So I think there are arguments that structure can enhance trust in news. We've certainly seen that with the automated journalism work in news labs, and there's been a series of studies that show that consumers trust automated news more than handwritten news. There's been a series of about 6 studies that confirm that. So the evidence is that trust from process, it can be real.
So that could be a way to regain trust with news consumers. That's basically the position you take, and it's not lost in some kind of.
It's essentially it's about changing the basis of trust. Like in the one-to-many communication environment, that the basis of trust is I'm a journalist, trust me. I'm the New York Times. What I say must be true. That is less and less the case in the many-to-many communication environment. And so, a different basis for trust becomes more important. And that could be something like, I talked to 20 people, here's the number of people I talked to. 6 of them said this and 8 of them said that, and somebody else said something else. Here are the source documents that I consulted, to document your work as it's sometimes described. And that's something, even describing the process by which you've done the article. How many sources did you talk to? That's not something that's commonly shared with news consumers. And part of the reason is because it's structure and there isn't an easy way to share it. But in this new environment, there might be.
Here's a concern raised with Katja Schmidt and also Leonie Rotacker asked, basically, you talked a lot about personalization, so playing out different modules to different audiences, personalize, individualize. And the concern is that if you personalize more, like with Facebook in a way, and doesn't that create more bubbles and division in societies and polarization, maybe even that people look only for their specific context of reality? And yeah, well, is it just feeding into this whole idea of getting more separated because we are more individualized, or is it can it work in another direction? And in what way would you argue that it goes in the other direction to build consensus, establish evidence, agree on certain things which are proven very well on this kind of stuff?
I think that's a key point. It's especially important for public service organizations like the BBC to address that. I think there's a range of stories, some of which are very important for people to know, and some of which are not very important for everybody to know. In the BBC's context, the universality of news stories right across the country. There are some stories that it's part of our mandate to communicate those. But when I'm talking about personalization, I'm not necessarily just talking about the stories themselves. I'm talking about how those stories are communicated. So, for example, if you have a complex political story, it doesn't necessarily make sense to communicate that in the same way to everybody, because you might, you're probably not reaching a substantial portion of your audience if you've got a one-size-fits-all form of communication. So perhaps some people like Instagram stories, some people like a few bullet points, some people like 1,000 words of text, some people like video, some people like interactive experiences on voice. There's a lot of different ways to communicate, and personalization of the story, but then also in how it's told, even more context, less context, more description, less description. These can help people to understand stories.
Yeah, I have maybe two more questions which I find interesting. One is, do you understand modularization as a way of rationalizing news production for an individual outlet, or as a kind of a task for all journalists? This speaks to the issue of competition and maybe cooperation. And would you agree that it's sensible to have one or two meta news aggregators working all together for the bits of journalism produced by a single outlet? So that could be a way of
I think that's a big question. My own view is that public service news organizations might have a special role to play in this. I think one of the characteristics of modular networked news is a winner-take-all phenomena. The network, which is the sort of the heart of this form of news, network news. The more you have in your network, the denser your network, the more useful it will be, and therefore the more resources you will have, and therefore the more dense it will be, and so on. And that virtuous cycle, as it does with social media and other things, tends towards winner take all, or a few winners taking the bulk of the activity. My own view is that's both good because it rebundles news and enables monetization. But I really hope that it's it's a public service minded organization that does control those news networks, if that's the way it ends up.
One last question, very interesting too. What thoughts do you have about the timeliness of information that can be reused in such modules? So if time and maybe the information is no longer valid or true and it changes, so do we need some kind of expiration dates in these kind of products? Or how would it be controlled? What is still
the tagging of news artifacts so that when it expires and what triggers the expiration, that's a very big part of metadata for structured news. An example is on voice devices. If you were to ask somebody for the latest, whatever it is, the latest results in an election, say in the US, then you have to know what they are. You can't just have a single number. Or if you want to ask somebody what what is the latest Brexit proposal, or when was this Brexit proposal proposed? You have to know when it's no longer relevant. An example is the in the UK in the Brexit negotiations back last year, this idea of the Northern Ireland backstop was a major story. And then there was a change in policy in the government, and that entire story became irrelevant. And so finding ways to tag that is going to be important if this form of news is going to be broadly useful.
Okay, David, thanks a lot. It was a very stimulating hour, I guess, and we got many questions. And for now, thank you a lot. And for all of you, we will have another little session where everybody can come together and sit on a table and talk to each other and do a little bit more socializing. You just follow the link in the chat. The program is called Remo. So you can just go there and then sit on a table and talk to other people, have a virtual beer or wine or glass of water. And so hope to see you there soon at 5 o'clock. So thanks again, David. It was a great pleasure to have you here. And yeah, we will hear from each other soon.
Yeah. Thank you. Take care.
Thanks all for listening, and see you soon. Bye.